What if everything you thought you knew about a person was a carefully constructed lie? For over half a century, the world thought it knew Elizabeth Taylor. The violet eyes, the river of diamonds, the 8 marriages. She was a living, breathing headline, a scandal factory that churned out drama for the tabloids. She was a product, an image, a myth. The world defined her, and for the most part, she let them. When she tried to share her version of events, it was often dismissed as melodrama, the complaints of a spoiled star. But what if she left behind the evidence? What if she kept a record of the truth, hidden away from the flashbulbs and the gossip? Columns? For decades, the world saw Elizabeth Taylor through the lens of tabloid headlines and scandalous rumors, often pushing her side of the story to the margins. Now, intimate audio tapes and newly opened access to her private diaries are forcing a major reassessment of her life, revealing a shocking story of abuse and agency. For years, her most private thoughts were locked away. Now that they're out, the first page of this secret history reveals a story she took to her grave, a story that begins not with glamour, but with violence. Before the diaries, before the tapes, there was Elizabeth Taylor, the brand. She was one of the first truly modern celebrities, a woman whose life was lived under a relentless public glare from childhood. A product of the old Hollywood studio system, she wasn't just in the business of making movies. She was the product itself. And Elizabeth was MGM's crowning jewel. From the age of 12, when she galloped into global stardom in national velvet, her life was no longer her own. The studio dictated her roles, her diet, her dates, and most importantly, her image. They created what she'd later call the cellophane Elizabeth, a perfect, polished, and transparently fake version of herself. This was the Elizabeth the world was sold, a breathtaking ingenue, a romantic ideal, and the public bought it completely. Her first marriage was a key part of this marketing strategy. In 1950, at just 18, she married Conrad Nicky Hilton, Jr., heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune. It was a match made in publicity heaven. MGM masterfully leveraged the event, with the release of the film Father of the Bride coinciding with the wedding, essentially turning her real-life nuptials into a promotional event. The wedding itself was a spectacle, a lavish affair with significant studio involvement where photos splashed across magazines showed a beaming teenage bride in a fairy tale romance. This was the narrative. The cellophane Elizabeth at her most potent, the beautiful, beloved child bride. But beneath the surface, the cellophane was tearing. The public saw a fairy tale. The reality, as Elizabeth would later testify, was a nightmare. The problem was, when the truth began to leak out, it was messy and inconvenient. It didn't fit the brand. The world saw headlines about a rocky marriage and a quick divorce, chalking it up to the whims of a flighty young actress. They didn't see the bruises. They didn't hear the threats. It was far easier to believe the studio's story, the tabloid's story. It would take decades, and the unearthing of her most private records to finally set the record straight. The honeymoon was supposed to be a 3-month European dream. For the public, it was an extension of the Hollywood romance. But for the 18-year-old Elizabeth, it was an immediate and brutal awakening. The man she married, Nicky Hilton, was not the charming prince the world saw. Away from the cameras, a different man emerged, one fueled by alcohol, gambling, and a volatile temper. In her writings and later accounts, which often struggled to gain traction against the Hilton family's power, Elizabeth described a harrowing ordeal. The abuse, she claimed, began almost immediately. He was sullen, angry, and cruel. This wasn't just a young couple fighting. This was a pattern of control and violence. One of the most horrific allegations, which she first made public in her 1988 autobiography, Elizabeth Takes Off, concerned a pregnancy. She revealed that during a fit of rage, Hilton had attacked her, kicking her and causing her to miscarry. For years, This was her word against a powerful narrative. But with authorized biographers now given access to her private letters and diaries, her long-standing claims are being seen with new weight, reinforcing a grim history of abuse. The marriage lasted only 8 months. She filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty, refusing alimony. To the world, it was another Hollywood flash in the pan. The studio machine went into damage control, and the narrative was spun. It was immaturity, a mistake. The word abuse was not part of the public vocabulary then, certainly not for a star of her magnitude. It was better for business to paint her as fickle rather than as a victim. The Hilton marriage was the first major crack in the cellophane Elizabeth. She had tried to tell her story. She testified in court. She wrote about it. But her voice was often drowned out by the louder, more convenient story written for her by others. The recent access to her archives doesn't just add detail. It serves as corroboration from the grave, a final insistence on a truth that was denied for far too long. If the marriage to Nikki Hilton was a private hell masked by a public fairy tale, her relationship with Eddie Fisher was a global scandal that hid a story of profound grief and desperate loneliness. The world remembers the narrative. Elizabeth Taylor, the homewrecker, stealing America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds' husband. It was a story Taylor made for screaming headlines. But the truth, as revealed with shocking intimacy on newly surfaced audio tapes, was far more tragic. The story begins with a devastating loss. In 1958, Elizabeth's third husband, producer Mike Todd, was killed in a plane crash. By all accounts, he was the great love of her life. She was shattered, plunged into a deep grief. She found solace in one of Todd's closest friends, the singer, Eddie Fisher. The public saw a whirlwind affair. The press had a field day. Fisher was married to actress Debbie Reynolds, and the three had been portrayed as best friends. The narrative was simple. The grieving widow, in a fit of selfish passion, betrayed her friend and destroyed a happy home. She was publicly condemned and branded a homewrecker, a reputation that would cling to her for years. But on lost tapes, hours of candid interviews recorded in 1964, she tells a profoundly different story. In her own voice, raw and unfiltered, Elizabeth dismantles the myth. "I never loved Eddie," she states plainly. "I liked him. I felt sorry for him, but he was not Mike." She calls the union one big friggin' awful mistake. The marriage wasn't an act of passion. It was born of shared grief, a desperate attempt to cling to the life she'd lost. The tapes reveal a woman not in control, but trapped in a marriage of misery and isolation. The loneliness became so profound that she admits to something the public never knew, a suicide attempt. She recounts taking sleeping pills, deliberately, calmly, and in front of Eddie, a haunting confession of her despair. Perhaps most chilling, however, is an account of terrifying intimidation. In the recent documentary, Elizabeth Taylor, The Lost Tapes, which draws from these recordings, it's recounted that as their marriage crumbled, Fisher held a gun to her head. According to reports on the incident, he told her, "You're much too pretty to kill." Hearing these events described transforms the story from a scandal into a chapter of profound pain and survival. The affair between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton wasn't just a romance. It was a global phenomenon. It began on the set of Cleopatra, a spectacle of a film almost overshadowed by the drama between its married stars. The paparazzi swarmed, the public was enthralled, and the Vatican famously condemned their public adultery, citing erotic vagrancy. They became the original celebrity supercouple, living a life of yachts, jets, and fabled jewels that seemed beyond mortal comprehension. This was the ultimate love story sold to the public, passionate, tempestuous, and endlessly fascinating. But what was the reality behind the myth? For decades, we only had glimpses. Now, through Richard Burton's own published diaries and Elizabeth's private letters, A far more complex and often agonizing picture emerges. Burton was a prolific writer, and his love letters to Elizabeth are a testament to their ferocious bond. "I am forever punished by the gods for being given the fire and trying to put it out," he wrote. "The fire, of course, is you." In his diary, he described her as beautiful beyond the dreams of pornography and a wildly exciting love mistress. These weren't the words of a simple affair. They were the words of a man utterly consumed. Elizabeth reciprocated this intensity, but this incredible passion was a double-edged sword. Burton's diaries chronicled their alcohol-fueled fights and lust-filled nights. Confirming the volatility the public romanticized, he was painfully aware of his own flaws, pleading in one letter, "You must know, of course, how badly I treat you." The fundamental and most vicious, swinish, murderous, and unchangeable fact is that we totally misunderstand each other. "I love you and I always will. Come back to me as soon as you can." Their fights could be brutal. It was a relationship of extremes, swinging violently between adoration and aggression. What the letters and diaries provide that the tabloids never could is the context, the profound, almost frightening codependence that bound them. They couldn't live with each other, and they couldn't live without each other. In sharing his letters for a biography late in her life, Elizabeth's intention was clear: to honor what she considered the one true marriage of her life. These private writings peel back the caricature of Liz and Dick and reveal the raw, human story of two people caught in a love as destructive as it was magnificent. Elizabeth Taylor's story is one of constant reinvention, of a woman repeatedly refusing to be defined by the world. We've seen how her private writings reshape our understanding of her famous relationships, but her most powerful act of agency was still to come. A decision that would not only save her, but also change the way the world viewed recovery forever. Before we get there, if you're finding this story as compelling as we are, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments. Does hearing the truth from her own archives change how you see Elizabeth Taylor? By the early 1980s, the myth of Elizabeth Taylor, the survivor, the fighter, was fraying under the weight of a dangerous struggle with prescription painkillers, sleeping pills, and alcohol. According to biographer Kate Anderson Brower, between 1983 and 1988 alone, doctors wrote a combined 1,000 prescriptions for 28 different drugs for Taylor. The situation grew so dire that her family and close friends staged an intervention in 1983. They were terrified they were going to lose her. The intervention, she later admitted, stopped me so dead in my tracks. Faced with the love of her family, she made a decision that was, at the time, unprecedented for a star of her stature. On December 5, 1983, Elizabeth Taylor checked herself into the Betty Ford Center. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this was. In 1983, addiction was still deeply stigmatized, a source of shame to be hidden. But Elizabeth chose to take control of the narrative. Knowing the news would leak, she went public herself. Her decision had a seismic impact. She was the first, truly massive star to publicly enter the Betty Ford Center, and in doing so, she helped kick the door open for others. Her message was powerful. Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing, and there is no shame in seeking help. Her time at the center was a radical departure from her life as an icon. She shared a room, mopped floors, and participated in group therapy. "I felt really for the first time in my life I wasn't being exploited by anyone," she later said. "I was being accepted for myself." The journey wasn't a straight line. She would return to the center in 1988. But her willingness to face her demons so publicly had a lasting effect. After a lifetime of being controlled, by the studio, by abusive men, by public opinion, and finally by her own addictions, she took back control in the most public way imaginable. She turned her moment of vulnerability into a source of strength, not just for herself, but for millions. It was a pivot that would lead directly to the final and perhaps most meaningful act of her life, her trailblazing activism in the fight against HIV/AIDS. For all the biographies written, the unvarnished story of Elizabeth Taylor remained just out of reach. That all changed with access to two monumental archives: the unearthing of hours of intimate audio interviews from 1964, and the decision by her estate to grant access to her private diaries and letters. Together, these have forced a complete reassessment of a life we thought we knew. The first key is the collection now known as the Lost Tapes. These were candid interviews with Life magazine's Richard Merriman, which formed the basis for the 2024 HBO documentary. For the first time, we hear Elizabeth telling her own story in her own voice, without a publicist's spin. Hearing her describe the fear and loneliness she felt transforms these events from sensational claims into visceral testimony. The second key is the trove of written material. Author Kate Anderson Brower was granted access to thousands of pages of her personal writings for the first-ever authorized biography. These documents provide the day-to-day emotional evidence behind the public drama. We can read the fiery love letters exchanged with Richard Burton, grounding their epic romance in their own raw words. When you place these two sources side by side, a new narrative emerges. The homewrecker tale is reframed as a story of a woman grappling with intense grief. The long-standing claims of abuse at the hands of Nikki Hilton are no longer just her word against a powerful family. They are part of a documented pattern. What these archives ultimately restore is Elizabeth's agency. For so much of her life, her story was told for her. The studio told a story of a perfect star. The tabloids told a story of a scandalous siren. But in her diaries, her letters, and on those lost tapes, she was quietly, persistently telling her own story all along. The opening of these archives finally centers her voice, allowing it to be heard clearly for the first time. For decades, the world was content with the cellophane Elizabeth, the beautiful, scandalous, two-dimensional icon. Her attempts to articulate the pain and complexity of her life were often dismissed as the histrionics of a drama queen. The myth was more entertaining than the messy human reality. But access to her diaries and the unearthing of her lost audio tapes have shattered that myth. These are not just artifacts. They are a resurrection of a voice that was systematically silenced. In her own words, we are introduced to a new Elizabeth Taylor, not a victim, but a survivor of horrific abuse. Not a homewrecker, but a grieving widow who made a desperate mistake. And finally, not a tragic figure, but a trailblazer who took control of her own recovery and, in doing so, destigmatized addiction for millions. The archives don't just add new facts. They change the meaning of her story. They expose the chasm between public perception and private reality, and stand as a testament to the importance of listening. They prove that behind the violet eyes and the diamonds, there was a woman of fierce intelligence and extraordinary resilience, fighting her entire life to be seen for who she truly was. The final truth of Elizabeth Taylor's life is not in the headlines she generated, but in the secret history she wrote herself. Her story is a stark reminder that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, has a way of finding the light. The only question is, now that we can finally hear her, are we truly ready to listen?